Welcome to part two of these three little sessions on improving your sight reading. What we're going to do in this part is to look at building reading skills and sight reading skills. I've made a slight differentiation between the two, but in fact they are all appropriate. So, in the back of our minds, you'll remember from last time, the musical map of the world, because I want to show you particularly how we connect one or two of these areas with all these particular skills that we're going to develop. So the first really is all about looking at the music and having some idea what it sounds like. And when you look at music, is anything going on in your head from the point of view of hearing the notation, hearing the rhythm, hearing the pitch? And if it's not so much at the moment, I don't want you to worry, it doesn't matter, but I want you to start thinking about it. When you look at music, for example, you see the symbols on the page, you play it, or indeed sing it, and then what comes out is an unexpected sound. I want us to move away from that. I want us to move away from notation being code for doing something physical. When I see that note, I press that particular key down. Instead, I want it to be that here's the notational symbols. We understand what those symbols are saying. We hear a sound, and then we go to the physical action to make it work. And I want you to spend some real time thinking about how that works. So, for example, I'm not suggesting you start with a complex piece, but find some simple music and just look at it, try to hear it in your head, and then play it. And if you practice doing that, there are books, I will maybe suggest one in the final section. There are books that will help you do this, that teach this kind of technique in a very systematic, logical, sequential way. But if you don't have such books, then just find some simple music and just begin to spend time looking at the music, doing your best to hear it in your head, and then play it. And I can guarantee that eventually that skill will improve. Now we move on to understanding and remembering the key signature, which is also very much linked to key awareness. Here are the bubbles, as it were, from my map. I'm not going to always refer to these, but here we are making a connection between notation and theory and oral. So are you one of those people who kind of live in C major, and when you're playing a piece in B flat major, you're thinking, I've got to remember those two flats, or in A major, I've got to remember those three sharps. The problem with that is that it takes up a lot of brain space, and we need that brain space just to allow the whole process of sight reading to work, for our brain to process the rhythms and the notes. We don't want to have to think about that. We want them to draw on those patterns and those understandings we already have. Similarly, with key awareness. And the main point I want to make here is let's practice our scales, but with great intent and understanding that the reason we are practicing our scales, well, there are many reasons, obviously technical reasons, for example, but in this particular case, to give us a real understanding of the patterns, the finger patterns that are that scale. So, for example, when we are playing in B flat major, I want you to think about the finger patterns of B flat major. And almost, as it were, to think of the clarinet as, this clarinet is now in B flat. I know a clarinet is in B flat, you know what I mean. But this clarinet at this particular moment is in the key of B flat. We're thinking of those patterns, the B flats, the E flats, the particular patterns that make up B flat major. So we begin to think in the key. And with a bit of time, you'll find you begin to do this. And if you practice all your scales thinking in those particular ways, you begin to think in a key. And when you're playing a piece in a key, you're aware of it more. You're not just having to try to remember those sharps or flats, which, as I say, take up a lot of brain space and will actually prohibit you from allowing yourself to process some of the other ingredients to make the sight reading fluent and continuous and accurate. So just a little bit about keys and key awareness. Then we move on to another very useful activity in learning to become better at sight reading. And here I simply want you to look at the music you're about to sight read. And if you're working with a teacher, you can talk, or if you're on your own, you can just do this in your mind. Create a running commentary. Look at the music and talk about what you see. Let me give you an example. So here's a little phrase. And I'm just talking about the notation here, not the actual fingering or anything like that, but the notation. What do I want you to see? What I want you to see really, and this might come out in your running commentary, is it begins with a 2-note phrase, and that 2-note phrase is descending. You could say it's E and D and it's crotchets, but it's a 2-note phrase descending. Then you see an upward arpeggio of C major. What do you see next? Another 2-note phrase descending, and it's the same as the first 2-note phrase, but an octave higher. And then we see that arpeggio again, but this time descending. Now the whole point of going through this rather laborious process is that you really are teaching your brain to see these as patterns, like you see a word. And so when you begin to read it, you won't need to read each individual note. You will read each pattern as a complete whole. And you can see the advantage of this. It means that you're able to look ahead more quickly because you've perceived a pattern. You don't have to look at it in detail. You perceive the pattern. Your eyes, and therefore your brain, can look ahead, see what's coming next, prepare that, and then your brain will work out that next pattern. And as you get into this sort of role, you really are beginning to become much more fluent in the way that you're sight reading. Here's another example. And you can see here, you really only need 2 glances. One for the first bar, one for the second bar, because the first bar is an arpeggio of C major and the second bar is a descending scale. And once you grasp that, and you can probably grasp it in one glance, you can just see how this is going to really impact on the fluency of your sight reading. So giving it a running commentary is a very useful technique to develop. And this very much connects into the next thought, which is looking ahead. And really, if you do this, if you think about the fact that all patterns are patterns, and more notes begin to form patterns which you can understand, comprehend in your mind, you begin to look ahead in a natural sort of way. You don't really even have to think about it. Some people get a friend or a teacher to cover up music as they're playing it, as they're sight reading it, or maybe unfold the music as you're moving forward, and that in a way forces the eye to look ahead. You don't need to do that if you're aware of reading in patterns and the fact that you can take in quite a few notes within a pattern in one glance. You will begin to look ahead naturally, and again you'll feel this is really impacting on the fluency of my sight reading. Eye movement itself, we can't actually determine our eye movement. It's very much based on what we are doing, what we are thinking, how we do things. In actual fact, they say that the eyes can move up to about 6 times in 1 second. And once you begin to see patterns and understand these patterns, your eyes will move more and you will begin to look ahead. I know that when I'm reading orchestral music, I'm looking all over the place. I'm looking through the line, I'm looking to the next line, all sorts of things. And you'll find that you begin to do this also. So, moving ahead, can you read this silently to yourself quickly? Okay, hope you read that. I wonder whether you've spotted my typos. For example, did you notice that accurately has got 3 C's? Did you notice that phrasing was missing an R? Did you notice that articulation was misspelt, as was perfect? And also, if you're so inclined, you might have noticed that there is a grammatical error there too. I don't know whether it picks it up for you. Yes, it does. There you are. The point is, though, even though I made some mistakes in my typing, it didn't affect your understanding of that paragraph when you read it. You may or may not have noticed them, and if you were reading it quickly, which is what I hoped you were doing, you probably didn't notice them. And the whole point here is that I want you to understand that we can develop our musical instinct. And that is simply to say that we see patterns, we see shapes, and it might be a scale pattern. There might be a third in that scale pattern, breaking the movement of just next door neighbour notes. And with our quick glance, maybe we put that third in a different place, but it doesn't matter when you're sight reading. The fact is, it's more important to be in the right place at the right time and getting the general gist of it. If you're sight reading for an exam, it's more important to keep the pulse and the rhythm as accurate and continuous as possible. And if you play a wrong note, that's what I'm supposed we're talking about here, but the wrong note was a sensible wrong note, if you see what I mean, just an alternative third for the third that we actually played, it doesn't matter. And certainly when I'm examining sight reading and someone does something like that, it really will have virtually no effect on their final mark. They kept going, the rhythm was good, they may have played a different note in an arpeggio, really doesn't matter. And as a good sight reader, developing your musical instinct is very important. Let's just talk a little about fingering. What's the point of fingering? The point of fingering really is so that you're in the right place to play the next note. And it doesn't really have not much to say about this really in terms of playing the clarinet. If you're a pianist as well, for example, there's a lot to think about because your hand always needs to be in the right position so you can play the next note. But there is some impact here on clarinet playing, and that, for example, may be crossing the break or different alternative fingerings for the bell notes. And in a sense, the best way to be sure on this is working through our scales. And if we know our scales and arpeggios, then we just understand the appropriate fingering that's going to be necessary for a particular passage. And if we're perceiving the clarinet in a key, as I was talking about earlier, then I don't think fingering is ever going to be a problem in sight reading. I was talking earlier about developing quick processing speeds, quick thinking, fast reactions. There's a lot to process when we are sight reading, but I think if you're practicing in the way that we've been talking about, eventually, because we are drawing on knowledge that is known, we will get much quicker in our thinking. Our reactions to what we see will become a lot quicker anyway. It'll kind of improve automatically. Just want to say a little bit about improvisation. You might be thinking, well, what's the reason of even thinking about improvisation in terms of sight reading? Aren't these two very different skills? And in fact, they're not. Here are some common features between sight reading and improvisation. Both are concerned with the unknown. Both are taken, generally speaking, without preparation, and both require the performer to adapt to the moment, which is a bit like what we do in sport. And so I want you to do some improvising. Maybe you might improvise in a key, and that's a good thing. It just makes you think more about that key. Maybe take a rhythm and improvise using a rhythm, or a particular pattern where you just use that pattern and you develop it in a little improvisation. Or maybe take a little structure, a very simple structure, A, B, A. You do something very short, then you do something a bit different, and then you go back and do the first thing again. And just by thinking through this, by playing this game, doing this activity, surprisingly, you are, maybe slightly indirectly, but you are developing sight reading skills. And finally, really, is we do want to have the brain space for observing dynamic markings and other markings of expression and articulation when we sight read. It's important because we want to play musically. And again, going back to exams, so often I don't hear those extra areas attended to, which is a shame. And of course, if you do understand the rhythms, if you do understand the pitch and the various patterns there, because of your knowledge, then of course the ability to do these other markings will become much easier for you, because you've got the brain space to think about these other markings. You see them. If you're worried about remembering the B flats and the E flats, then of course you won't have any room to put these markings in. So it's a process, and I think if we take each of these skills, spend a little time on them in practice, they are developing. They are developable, if there is such a word, and you will find that your whole ability becomes much more secure, and you're able to sight read with a lot more accuracy and continuity. So, just to summarise, when you're working at your sight reading, make sure that you're making connections. You're really thinking, how does this connect? Which are the particular connections I need to make as I'm working on this? Make sure that you understand the rhythmic patterns, you understand the keys. Read regularly. That thing you remember, going through the verbal, making that or into yourself, just talking yourself through the patterns, really important as you're doing this regular reading. Make sure that there aren't any technical problems. A technical problem will always slow you up. It will always block the flow. So make sure you've had a look first and there aren't any technical problems. And always be working at lots of pieces. I find people tend to really just practice 2 or 3 pieces. If you're doing an exam, maybe 3 pieces. And if you're just playing normally, maybe you're just learning and concentrating on 2 or 3 pieces. But why not have lots of pieces on the go, so that you are having to interact with lots of different kinds of notation, different kinds of patterns. The more you do, of course, the better you will become at recognise them, and the better you're becoming as a sight reader. So look forward to seeing you in part 3 soon.